Mr. Ahmed here. Goal for today is how do I solve a quadratic equation using a radical? So essentially we're going to look at a different way of solving a quadratic. So we're going to have an x squared by taking the square root. The reason why we are going to take the square root is because the square root will cancel out squared. And in that process, this assignment will correlate with 9.3 from the big ideas. So this is for use with 9.3 in big ideas. So we can only use a radical if there's just an x squared. So there's not an x term involved. So we'd have something like x squared plus 6 equals 0. There's no x, just x squared. If there's an x, we're going to have to factor, all right? So for us to use this method, we're going to isolate the x squared just like we're solving an equation. And then after that, we are going to take the square root of both sides because the square root undoes squared. When we think about a square root, the square root means what number times itself is that number. So if I take the square root of, let's just say, 16, we're looking for what number times itself is 16. And in this case, that would be 4, because I just wrote it as the square root of 16. However, when we're solving an equation, if it says x squared equals 16, there's actually two solutions to this, because there's two numbers times itself that are equal to 16. And when I think of that, the two numbers times itself that's equal to 16, one of them is 4, because 4 times 4 is 16, and the other one is negative 4, because negative 4 times negative 4, negative times a negative is a positive, is also equal to positive 16. So there's actually two solutions. So when we take the square root, when we insert it into an equation, if I put it there, I have to take both the positive square root and the negative square root. All right? So we're going to hop into some examples. And the process, we need to first isolate the x squared. So we got to get x squared by itself. And that's just like solving a regular old equation. So in this problem, the first thing I'm going to do is add 32 to both sides. And we'd be left with 2x squared equals 32. After that, divide both sides by 2 because it's being timesed. And I am left with x squared equals 16. And now this is the point where I am going to insert the square root into the equation to undo the squared. So if I take the square root, if I put it there, I have to do both the positive and the negative. So the square root of 16 is 4, so x is equal to both positive and negative, plus and minus 4. When I have that positive over the negative, that means it's both positive 4 and it's negative 4. Those are the two solutions. You could also write it as x equals 4 and x equals negative 4. Either way is acceptable. Okay? So that is using square roots. This is actually a little bit easier than factoring, but keep in mind it only works if there's just an x squared. Okay? Now for the next one, we are going to isolate the x squared, so I have to divide both sides by 5. 5 over 5 cancels. X squared is equal to 5. Now we are going to take the square root to undo the squared, both the positive and the negative. Now this is a problem where I don't really know what the square root of 5 is. So we are going to use decimals, all right? And you're going to take out your calculators, and you are going to type in the square root. Now on the one calculator that I have, the square root is right above this squared, so I have to press the second key, then the square root, 5, enter. As a decimal, we will round it to 2 decimal places, so it will be 2.23, the next number 6, that rounds up, so it's 2.24. Now keep in mind, x was equal to both positive and negative 2.24. And those are our two solutions, okay? Now, when you use your calculator on the computer, just be careful to kind of give it a couple shots. Maybe take the square root of 16 or square root of 25 first so you can make sure that you're typing it in correctly. All right, number 3. Next one, isolate the x squared. first thing I'm going to do is undo addition and subtraction. So I'm going to subtract 11 from both sides. And I'm left with negative 5x squared equals 16 minus 11 is 5. Divide both sides by negative 5. Divide negative 5. X squared equals negative 1. Now we're going to take the square root of both sides. Now when I type in the square root of negative 1, let's see what happens. Second square root, negative 1. Error. I swear I typed it in right. Let's try that one more time. Square root negative 1. It's definitely correct. Error. Why is that? Well, we're looking for a number times itself that's equal to negative 1. I don't know of a number times itself that's equal to negative 1 because the problem is a positive times a positive is a positive. A negative times a negative is also a positive. So if we're looking for a number squared to equal a negative, there is not a real solution that exists. So we will just simply state no solution. There is not anything that is going to make that true in the real number domain. Okay? Doesn't exist. Okay, solving in the form a times x minus h squared plus k. This time, the squared is in a grouping of parentheses, so we are going to isolate that squared first. After that, we can take the square root of both sides and then solve for x. So this one's going to be a little bit challenging because when we take the square root, we have to both do the positive and the negative again. So we'll have to write out two separate equations. All right? So x minus 1 squared, it is isolated already. So we're going to take the square root. X minus h is isolated. Square root of both sides. Square root, but it also has to be the positive and the negative. So when I rewrite this, x minus 1, it cancels the squared. Squared and square roots cancel. Equals, well, square root of 25 is 5, but it's both positive and negative 5. So we now have to write out two equations to solve this. X minus 1 has to equal 5, and x minus 1 also has to equal negative 5. And then we'd solve both so we can find both solutions. Add 1, x is equal to 6. Add 1, x is equal to negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4. So notice, I didn't just add 1 and say it's positive and negative 6. You have to rewrite both equations to solve it. Okay? Next one. This time, the squared and the parentheses are not isolated, so I need to move the 4 first. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4 because it's being multiplied. Divide by 4. All right, 4's cancel. X minus 3 squared is equal to 9 over 4. Leave it as a fraction. Reason why I left it as a fraction is those are perfect squares. We're going to try and pick out numbers that work out well. So now when I take the square root of both sides, both the positive and the negative, I can take the square root of 9 and the square root of 4. The square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 4 is 2, so it's 3 over 2. Equals x minus 3, squared and square roots canceled. Now we set up our two separate equations. X minus 3 has to equal both positive 3 over 2 and x minus 3 also has to equal negative 3 over 2. And then we'd solve both equations separately. So add 3, add 3. Use your calculator for that process, all right? 3 over 2 is 1.5, so when I add that up, you could call it 4.5, or you could call it 9 over 2. I really don't care. I'm going to call it 4.5. Use your calculator when you type that in. And now on the other side, x minus 3, add 3, add 3. Now we have negative 1.5 plus 3, which is 1.5. So fraction, decimal. If you run into some issues on your assignment, which one it accepts, please let me know. Okay? The U tries. again, this is a good option for you to pause the video, try it out, and then if you get stuck, restart the video to take a look, all right? So the first one, we just have an x squared, no x. Gonna isolate the x squared. Add 27, add 27. 3x squared equals 27. Divide 3, divide 3. X squared equals 9. Now I got the x squared isolated. To undo the squared, take the square root of both sides, both the positive and the negative. Has to be both. So x is equal to plus and minus 3. Okay? Last one. X minus h, the whole group, the parentheses, it's isolated. To undo the squared, take the square root of both sides, both the positive and the negative. That's the key. Don't forget that plus and minus. There's two solutions for most of these. So x plus 3 equals plus and minus, square root of 4 is 2. Now set up both equations. X plus 3 equals 2, and x plus 3 equals negative 2. Subtract 3, subtract 3. X is equal to negative 1. Subtract 3, subtract 3, and x is equal to negative 5. We have found both solutions. So these ones are going to take a little practice. Make sure to watch these videos a couple times, work through them, use the tutorials. And like we say, if you have any questions, please send me an email and we'll send up a group Google Meet and go over them together. Have a great rest of the day.